Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, inflation continues to batter American families at a rate we have not seen in 40 years. Since last year, the price of items that Texans use every day have increased more than 9%. That is, if your paycheck is still the same, you have 9% less purchasing power just since last year. At the grocery store, the price of bread is up nearly 11%. Chicken's up more than 17%, and the price of eggs has jumped a whopping 33%. You know what I sense is a huge disconnect between the folks here in Washington, perhaps in Congress, that this does not have a dramatic effect on in terms of our daily lives. But the people we represent, the 29 million people I represent, this is real, it's happening now, and it's to the detriment of their quality of life. Groceries aren't the only thing that are challenging family budgets. Electricity is up 14%. I'll be traveling with some colleagues to the Rio Grande Valley this afternoon. I looked at the weather forecast for today and tomorrow. It'll be 104 degrees in the Rio Grande Valley, and no, it will not be a dry heat. And demand on our electricity is real because people cannot live without air conditioning and climate control. But in order to run your air conditioning, you're going to have to pay 14% more for that electricity this year as opposed to last year. Propane used at summer barbecues costs 26% more. And gasoline prices, there are about 280 million cars on the road today that run using gasoline. The price has jumped 60% since last year. If people want to go on a vacation, they just commute to work, they want to take their kids to summer camp, they got to pay 60% more for gasoline than they did last year. And for the first time, the national average of price has exceeded $5 a gallon. Over the last few weeks, thankfully, prices have fallen slightly, and I emphasize the word slightly, but there's no reason to celebrate. The national average is still about $4.60 a gallon, which is about $1.50 higher than it was last year alone. So the American people are looking to Washington, D.C., to their elected leaders, and they're wondering, why aren't you doing something about it? They want to know what the Biden administration's plans are to address these rising costs, especially when it comes to things that are not, there's some things you can substitute for others. I even saw a woman on the news said she decided to become a vegetarian because she couldn't afford the meat that it cost in the grocery store. But there's some things you simply are irreplaceable. And gasoline to drive your car is one of them. Well, one of the most logical ways to increase the supply of gasoline, because it really is about supply and demand, would be to boost American production of our domestic energy supply. That way we could reap the economic benefits of strong production here at home, along with the jobs that go along with it. We could continue to use our capability to export things like natural gas to countries that previously were dependent almost exclusively on the Russian Federation. Actually, the capacity of the United States to produce energy at home and export it around the world has changed the geopolitics of the planet in a very positive way. But unfortunately, we see the Biden administration has taken a different approach. He knows that a part of his political base would have an absolute meltdown if the president showed anything other than contempt for the domestic energy producers. And so he's come up with a different strategy that frankly makes no sense whatsoever. So he's on a trip to the Middle East, going to visit with Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and ask him to increase production of oil and gas from not the United States, but from Saudi Arabia. Forget American energy producers. President Biden would rather go hat in hand and talk to an autocrat, an oligarch in the Middle East, than he would to take his boot off the neck of American energy producers. So apparently, the president is not anti-fossil fuels. He's just anti-American fossil fuels. President Biden's trip illustrates a remarkable show of his priorities. He views the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia as a more dependable ally than energy producers in Texas. Well, the decision to shop for oil in the Middle East instead of harnessing what is in our backyard is absolutely baffling. The sooner the administration views domestic energy producers as a friend and ally rather than enemies, the better we will all be off. We are fortunate to live in a resource-rich country. Growing up, I learned in school that countries that are endowed with great natural resources have an advantage over other countries that do not have those natural resources, and we do have them here in the United States along with the technology to develop them. But for some strange reason, we just simply refuse to do so. Take what is a gift and ignore it completely and go hat in hand and talk to autocrats in other parts of the world and ask them to do what we should be doing here domestically. Well, Mr. President, on another matter, I'm eager to head home this afternoon to Texas, where, as I mentioned, the weather's a little warm. We've been having, I think, about 33 days of plus 100-degree temperatures. And as I was telling some of my colleagues here, no, it is not a dry heat, which is usually the response when you tell somebody how hot it is. They say, well, at least it's a dry heat. It's not. It's very hot. But it's summertime in Texas, so we expect it and we adjust to that. But we're going specifically to the Rio Grande Valley, which is that 1,200-mile strip of land that's contiguous to Mexico, between Texas and Mexico. And we're going with some of our Senate colleagues so they can see for themselves what Senator Cruz and I have seen before and come to learn as a result of talking to the world's best experts in what's happening at the border, and that is the people who live and work there. The men and women who live and work along our border are the experts and the best people to talk to and learn from, which is one reason why I continue to be disappointed that the Vice President, having been appointed border czar or immigration czar, has yet to make a substantive visit to the border to do what we will do this afternoon and tomorrow, which is to listen and learn. And maybe, just maybe, it would prompt a change in the failed policies which have created a huge humanitarian crisis. Well, the folks who live and work on the border know the strain this has placed on local law enforcement, on their hospitals, on their schools, and the danger it creates for their communities. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about safety concerns in those communities. Cities in the Rio Grande Valley and along Texas' southern border are not dangerous and lawless places. But the people who pass through there can be. And amidst the 3 million people who the Border Patrol has encountered in the last year and a half, there unfortunately presents opportunities for people with criminal records and people who are members of gangs and drug traffickers to be obscured by the vast flow of these 3 million people. But once people cross the border, they want to get to places like Chicago, San Diego, New York, Seattle, Atlanta. These are all places that have a presence of the drug cartels. Because what I don't think enough people realize is once the drugs come across the border, the same drugs that took the lives of 108,000 Americans last year through drug overdoses, once those drugs come across the border, the network by which they are distributed are largely criminal street gangs who are also responsible for most of the violence in our communities across the country because they're fighting each other for territory, for market share, to sell these illegal drugs to unsuspecting consumers. This is another reason for the spiking crime waves that we've seen in recent months across America. People want to act like this is something that's just contained in cities like Chicago, that's a local problem. No, this is a systemic problem that flows from the Biden administration's unwillingness to provide any level of controls to people coming across the border or to deter people from making the long, dangerous journey and perhaps dying in the process. I've been in Brooks County, which is where the Falfurrias checkpoint is. What happens is the smugglers smuggle people across the border, they put them in stash houses, and then periodically they'll get them in some vehicle and travel up the highway. But that's why we have Border Patrol checkpoints about 50, 60 miles inland. But what will happen is the smugglers will tell the migrants, get out of the car and meet me on the north side of this checkpoint. And maybe if they're lucky, they'll get a old milk carton full of water and maybe a power bar or something to sustain them. But I've seen the bleached bones of migrants who've been left behind and simply died in the process. And recognizing the extreme temperatures that exist, particularly at times like this in places like Texas, it's no surprise that a number of these migrants don't make it. Well, our Border Patrol is simply the front line in our law enforcement efforts along the border. But due to the failed policies of the Biden administration, the Border Patrol is unable to do the job that they swore to do, which is to defend and protect our borders, because they are simply overwhelmed by the number of people coming across. Last month, the Rio Grande Valley sector agents arrested 10 MS-13 members, one of the most violent gangs in the world, and 2 other gang members within a 4-day span. 12 gang members in 4 days, and that was in just one of 20 Border Patrol sectors. Since October, the Border Patrol has arrested more than 450 gang members, and we've already surpassed the total for the entire previous year. And the scary thing is, these are just the ones who were caught, because we know with the volume of people coming across, there are what the Border Patrol calls the getaways. And they estimate that as many as 300,000 more people are getting across the border unbeknownst to the Border Patrol, because they're simply preoccupied with these huge numbers, and they get away into the interior of the country. And once they get across the border, particularly if they are people who have an intention to do harm and commit crime in the United States, they will end up in Boston, they'll Sacramento, Detroit, Miami, or any other city in the United States. Somebody said, well, every city is a border city now. And for all practical purposes, that's true. Folks who live thousands of miles from the border can't write this off as a problem for somewhere else. This is a national problem. Gangs and cartels are sending their henchmen to our cities and our communities. They're trafficking in fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, and other deadly drugs, along with guns and human trafficking. They are what one person called years ago commodity agnostic. In other words, they're in it for the money. They don't care how they make the money. They don't care about the people. They're just in it for the money. And in doing so, they're ushering in crime and violence and creating unsafe communities all across our country. This administration has ignored the crisis at our southern border in an effort to appease open borders members of their political party. They've created a gateway for cartel and gang members to come into our country and wreak havoc on our communities. Criminal organizations are very sophisticated. Their business model is to overwhelm our capacity to stop them and to make that buck by selling people, drugs, or other contraband in the communities all across our country. So the situation at the border is not simply about immigration. It's about security. It's about public safety. It's about knowing who is crossing the border and coming to live in your community. So I'm eager to get back home to the Rio Grande Valley to talk to some of these men and women who are doing heroic work on the front lines of this crisis, who are getting no help from the Biden administration. As I said, I wish President Biden would come to the border. We would welcome him and show him what we have learned ourselves from our frequent trips there. Maybe if the president saw and learned about the impact of the failed policies of his administration in person, he would begin to take this crisis seriously. So, Mr. President, every state is impacted by the security breakdown at the border, and something needs to be done before the situation becomes even more dangerous than it currently is. Mr. President, I yield the floor.